Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Nancy O'Kale, and I'm the President and CEO of the Center for International Policy. The Center for International Policy was founded nearly 15 years ago by diplomats who opposed the war in Vietnam. They believed U.S. foreign policy could be grounded in law, accountability, and human dignity. Today, we are far from that vision. Today marks the 20th day of the United States and Israel's illegal war on Iran, a war launched without evidence on imminent threat, without congressional authorization, and without clearly defined objectives. What we are only seeing instead is catastrophic escalation without strategy. So far, the costs have been really severe. 7 U.S. service members have died. More than 1,000 civilians in Iran have lost their lives, including 168 schoolgirls in a single strike. Yesterday, actually, the Center for International Policy and Win Without War held a memorial with members of Congress for the victims of the strike on Capitol Hill. It was a sobering moment, one that underscored both the human toll and also the growing opposition for further funding for this war. And yet today, the Pentagon is reportedly seeking an additional $200 billion for the operations in Iran. We thought they were 50 billion, but they're apparently increasing it as we go. And as my colleague Matt Duss, the executive vice president of CIP, wrote on X, 50 billion or 200 billion, the message is still the same. A vote to fund the war is a vote to fund this war is a vote for the war. Meanwhile, the conflict is expanding, strikes now targeting oil and gas infrastructure with ripple effects already visible in the global energy markets. We are fortunate today to have three leading experts who would help us unpack the complexity and understand the tragedy that we are going through. Let me start by introducing Robert Malley, who is a lecturer and senior fellow at the Yale Jackson School and author with Hossein Agha of Tomorrow's Yesterday, Life, Death, and the Pursuit of Peace in Israel-Palestine. He served as U.S. Special Envoy for Iran from January 2021 to April 2023. Prior to that, he was president and CEO of the International Crisis Group. Under President Barack Obama, he served as special assistant to the president, among many other important and influential roles. Next is Joe Cirincione, who is the vice chair of the Center for International Policy's board and is the author or editor of 7 books, including Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It Is Too Late, and Bomb Scare, The History and Future of Nuclear Weapons. He served previously as the president of Plowshares Fund, a global security foundation, as Vice President of National Security at the Center for American Progress, Director for Non-Proliferation at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and as a Senior Fellow at the Stimson Center, again, amongst many other leading positions. Last but not least is my colleague, Sina Tusi, who is a Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Center for International Policy and a widely published writer on Iran and U.S. foreign policy. Previously, Sina was a Senior Research Analyst at the National Iranian American Council, where he focused on tracking discourse within Iran and the impact of U.S. foreign policy and spotlighting the human rights abuses of the Iranian government. Let me start right away with you, Robert, and ask you about, we've seen different narratives about the objective of this war that changed depending on the whims of President Trump that day, just as the case was Venezuela. And I want to ask you from your perspective, what do you think is the end game for the administration? What is their objective from your perspective?
Well, thank you, Nancy, and it's great to be joined be with Joe and Sina and CIP. Before there's in this conflict, there really are three main actors, two of whom are relatively predictable, relatively institutionalized, and whose actions one could foresee and one could understand. One is Iran, the other is Israel. I know Sina is going to speak about Iran, but just in a nutshell, their game plan has been pretty clear from the outset, which is to externalize the cost of the war, to make sure that others and not just Iran suffers the pain, and to make sure that the epilogue of this war doesn't become the prologue of the next. Again, Sina will say more about that. In Israel's case, I think it's also not a mystery. Their goal is regime collapse, instability, in what I would call an intensified, regionalized version of a mow the lawn strategy, which is no longer mow the lawn. It really is trample the ground beneath the lawn. So the chaos is, and the collapse of the state is not an incidental benefit. It is the goal. And again, I think that's been clear from day one, and we see it to this day. The less predictable, the less institutionalized, the more personalized actor, the one that really is, and the one that's in the driver's seat in a way, at least at the beginning, is the US. And it's the one that you've asked me to talk about, which is the hardest for that reason. It's an administration that came in not knowing what it wanted, expected to achieve what it didn't know it wanted right away, and then is frustrated that what its undefined goal hasn't been met. And that makes it extremely difficult, in particular because these calculations are taking within the mind of a single individual whose processes are hard to decipher and hard to fathom and to understand, and who lives in kind of a parallel reality. So in some ways, you need to be more of a psychologist than a policy analyst to be able to understand where he's going. And as you said, in this parallel reality, he's offered a whole series of shifting array of goals, not just day by day, but often hour by hour, which makes it very hard to figure out at what point he will land on the goal that he announces is the goal that he wanted to achieve. So stepping back, you could say at some level, the goal that has been the most consistently stated was to degrade Iran's missile, naval, drone, and nuclear capacity. If it's to degrade that capacity, in a way, it's already been achieved. And it's just a matter of how much degradation is sufficient. If the goal is to prevent Iran from ever replenishing that arsenal, then it's a very different matter and extremely difficult to achieve. Although at some points, that's been what's mentioned. If the goal is to sow chaos, and if not regime change, but at least an inability of the regime to govern effectively, then that's hard to achieve. And it's also self-defeating, because I think that would be a catastrophe for the Iranian people, for the region, and in particular for Europe. And finally, if the goal is regime change, which at some points, again, President Trump has mentioned, then it's purely a fantasy. Other points, he's mentioned the notion of having not regime change, but a change in the attitude of the regime towards the United States, sort of a Delcy Rodriguez Venezuela moment. Again, virtually impossible to envisage in the case of Iran, particularly after 3 weeks of a devastating war. Who in Iran is going to stand up and say, now we're prepared to make a deal with the US? So the bad news in all this is that it really is subject to the whims of a man whose impulses, whose impetuosity, whose patience or whose impatience is such that you never know from one day to the next whether he's going to look for a way out or whether he's going to try to redouble and escalate. What will ultimately define, in my view, when the president decides that it's time to call it quits, it's not any predetermined game plan. I think that's almost too obvious to necessitate stating. It's the pressures that he's going to be under because of exogenous factors that are going to make that cost, which I mentioned earlier. The Iranians want to make sure that the US suffers. So what's the price of oil? What's the reaction of the market? What is the reaction of whether it's wealthy people with deep pockets who are influencing the president, or some countries whose voice he may want to hear? And it's the battle of those voices against his desire to have some kind of dramatic victory that he could parade and say, I achieved all the goals that none of my predecessors could contemplate, even though they may have dreamed of. That's going to be the key moment. And I do think that's why what happens here in the US and what happens in Europe and the Gulf countries and others, what pressure they put on the president to say, this is driving the world economy, regional stability, European stability into the ditch. That's what's going to determine where he gets out not any predetermined war aim. And I would say, to end on a relatively optimistic, but everything is relative in this, as you described it correctly, unlawful, unnecessary, unjustified war. And I think we can't say that enough, is that if you don't have a goal, then any outcome won't reach it, will achieve it. And so if the president decides tomorrow to say absolute victory because, and he will make up whatever reality he wants, that will be the reality that matters to him. And therefore that will be the reality that he imposes on the world. Then the question, and Sina could talk about it, will be how does Iran react to a unilaterally declared ceasefire? But for me, the one is critical now is to see this war end. And there, as I said, the one sort of ray of hope is that a unpredictable president could at any moment declare victory on the basis of the parallel reality that he's built for himself.
Thank you, Rob. And unfortunately, the bar for hope is very low, obviously. I mean, just hoping for him to be satisfied and end it. I want to come to you, Sina. And earlier in January, we both co-authored a piece in the New Republic with the title Military Intervention Won't Liberate the Iranian People. And yet we're seeing how this is unfolding in a catastrophic way. I want to ask you the same question I asked Rob, but from the perspective of the Iranian regime. What do you think their objective right now?
Well, I think, the context for Iran's actions is very important. And, we could start the timeline at different places. We can start it in 79. We can start it in 53. I think right now I'm just going to start it at 2018 when Trump left the Iran nuclear deal, the Obama era nuclear deal. Iran at that time adopted a strategy that many people have called implicitly a strategy of strategic patience, where in retaliation for the US imposing very severe economic sanctions in 2018 and then escalating across the board in what was in Trump's first term arguably a regime change strategy. It wasn't really a tenable diplomatic strategy, I would argue. I mean, between Mike Pompeo as his Secretary of State, John Bolton as his National Security Advisor, very maximalist, untenable demands. But regardless, we saw in the face of this, Iran initially stayed in that deal for a year, hoping the Europeans could bring it some of the dividends, some of the promised dividends. That failed. Then at that time, it started gradually counter-escalating by breaching the terms of the nuclear deal itself. And this trajectory continued really since then, where Iran, especially once Rouhani left the office, I mean, President Biden came into office promising to return to the deal. Those efforts ultimately, unfortunately, failed to reach a result. And we saw that as there was a gradual consolidation of power by conservatives within Iran, by hardliners, Iran started very significantly expanding its nuclear program, going to higher levels of enrichment, higher stockpiles of enriched uranium. And then also during the same period, Iran was also counter-escalating in the region. I mean, many of the same things we're seeing Iran do at a very high level right now, it had been doing in kind of calibrated signaling ways since 2019. So for example, in September 2019, Saudi Aramco was struck. Half of Saudi production capacity was taken out temporarily in one attack that was widely believed to be Iran ultimately behind that attack. After Qasem Soleimani was assassinated in January 2020, Iran attacked the Ain al-Assad air base in Iraq. It telegraphed that attack. But regardless, just like right now, it's been hitting a lot of US bases in the Persian Gulf. That base was largely destroyed, or at least many key infrastructures within it were destroyed. There were even incidents with tankers and tankers being sabotaged, in that time frame, 2019, 2020. So all this is to say that Iran had demonstrated these capabilities. Even in the 2024 strikes with Israel, its missiles ultimately circumvented the multi-layered US and Israeli air defenses. Many of them hit targets. It depleted, the interceptor stockpiles of the US and Israel. So that strategy of calibrated counter-escalation by the Iranians, that their ultimate aim has always been economic relief, sanctions relief, and in the broader aim, some kind of strategic accommodation or settlement between the US and Iran. I mean, there's nuances here that matter. I mean, Iran is not monolithic, even within the Islamic Republic, the hardline camp, the moderate camp. But I would argue that the consensus position of the Iranian system with the JCPOA, with the efforts to try to resuscitate that or get to a new deal, was not to escalate towards a war or wanting such a war or wanting to disrupt the Strait of Hormuz, but to demonstrate their leverage, build enough of a bargaining chip to kind of get the U.S. to back down and have a sanctions relief and kind of be integrated into a new regional equilibrium. And I would argue that that's what the Iranians are doing now in this war. So we're seeing in this war, Iran's key leverage has been something that's bestowed upon it by geography, whereas it sits on the Persian Gulf. It has the longest coastline in the north of the Persian Gulf, right on the Strait of Hormuz, which is a very narrow strait ultimately. The most narrow part where these tankers have to go over deep water is about 2 miles, I believe. So, and Iran, even if it didn't have these pretty sophisticated drones and missiles, it could disrupt that. But does have, it's really invested in this sophisticated drone and ballistic missile program and cruise missiles and other forms of asymmetric warfare that have resulted in the strait being de facto closed. And a lot of U.S. bases in this region have been hit successfully, including critical military infrastructure. We know like certain radar facilities, THAAD air defenses, other bases, fuel refueling tankers in Saudi Arabia. And it's had these accumulating economic costs for the global economy. Now, the GCC states that they were on board with Trump's maximum pressure policy in his first term, and by his second term, and by Biden administration, even Saudi Arabia and these other GCC states pivoted off of that as the costs of maximum pressure became clear for them. As those escalations that Iran did in 2019, 2020 that I mentioned, as the Houthis struck Abu Dhabi and that war was going nowhere and was having costs for this model of the GCC. The model of the GCC, their political economy model, their security model is one that requires investor confidence, stability, ostensible U.S. security guarantees. Now, all of those are under strain right now, where the instability has come to Dubai, has come to Abu Dhabi, has come to Riyadh. All these grand economic visions, MBS's Vision 2030, these are all under extraordinary strain right now and under question. But Iran's strategy is one that it's trying to tie its fate to the fate of the Persian Gulf and by extension, global prosperity. That if Iran is to be targeted for collapse, for regime change, and this all-out kind of attack against it, that's going to its leverage is in this region, is in this critical choke point, and it's been counter-escalating this time. It went very high on the escalation ladder, and its strategy has been to, if the U.S. and Israel go up on the escalation ladder too, then it goes up significantly. I mean, for example, this South Pars gas field was hit yesterday, and then Iran hit a number of critical facilities, both in Qatar and Saudi Arabia and in Israel this morning at the Haifa reactor. So this escalation, it seems that, those voices in Tehran, and these debates have been, very strong, vociferous in Tehran for a long time between the more conservative IRGC-led camp and these moderate diplomatic voices who argued for restraint and getting to some kind of strategic settlement with America via vis-a-vis diplomacy. Those voices were ultimately discredited in the Iranian domestic political sphere. And now this kind of military first approach where Iran is using its military option and closing the strait, this thing that they've threatened for a long time. And it remains to be seen what's going to come of that. But for now, it seems like there's no good options for Trump. And Iran wants this to continue and to inflict such a cost so that it can emerge from this with a horizon for this war not happening again, having deterred this happening again down the road, and for some kind of economic relief, sanctions relief, because the worst, one of the bad scenarios for the Iranians would be to come out of this much like Saddam Hussein came out of the 1991 Gulf War, although there's very major differences, obviously, but to enter this dilapidated state where it's still under severe sanctions. So they're trying to basically use this shutdown as a bargaining chip for a better settlement down the road.
Thank you so much, Sina. With all the examples you mentioned of things getting out of hand, is also with every one of them, it shows that Trump is not in control of this war. Um, Joe, I want to come to you. Last September, I attended a meeting alongside the UN General Assembly with President Pezeshkian and some of the US think tankers and experts. And one thing he underscored in that meeting is that he said the wall of mistrust between the US and Iran is getting thicker and taller. And it sounded like that there was no real chance for another round of negotiations yet. And after what happened in June, they still went back to the negotiations table. What happened?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Nancy, for that question and for including me in this very distinguished panel. So let me answer that by talking about the state of the negotiations, what we know was on the table, and their failure to reach a deal, and then the state of the Iran nuclear program as we understand it at this point, and finally the options for the United States reducing the threat of Iran getting a nuclear weapon by further military action here. Let me start off a little further back because there are many adjectives you can use to describe this war: illegal, unauthorized, expensive, uncertain. But the one that sticks with me is unnecessary. There was no need for this war. There was no reason to go to war. Iran clearly was not an imminent threat. There was nothing that Iran was about to do or was going to do in the near future that threatened either United States national security or the security of our allies in the region. There's no need to go to war. And as for the nuclear issue, which has emerged as Donald Trump's central talking point, he says almost every day that Iran was 2 weeks away from getting a nuclear bomb. This is flatly false. This is absolutely untrue. There was not a scintilla of evidence presented to indicate that Iran was 2 weeks away from getting a nuclear weapon. He says it over and over again. One of his negotiators, Steve Witkoff, says it over and over again. It's flatly not true. It makes you miss Dick Cheney and George W. Bush, who at least presented some evidence, who at least had a rigged, false intelligence assessment that laid out their case for why they thought Saddam Hussein was near getting a nuclear weapon. We have nothing like that on this case. And the reason we know that Iran wasn't going to get, isn't that close to getting a nuclear weapon, the reason we know this war was unnecessary is because we had solved this problem. We had arrived at a diplomatic agreement first in 2013 with the interim agreement negotiated by Secretary of State John Kerry, which Rob Malley played an instrumental part in, and then further in 2014 and implemented in 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Let's be clear. This was not a flawed deal. This was not, as some people have described it, not a perfect deal. No. This was the diplomatic achievement of a generation, as Rachel Maddow called it. This was the most significant diplomatic achievement of the 21st century. Nothing else comes close. It solved the most difficult problem in international relations on a military level. It stopped all of Iran's pathways to a bomb, and it stopped a war. It shrank Iran's program down to a fraction of its size, put it in an iron box, and surrounded it with cameras and inspectors and SEALs. If this deal was still in effect, Iran's nuclear program would be a fraction of what it is today, or at least a fraction of it was before the June bombing and this bombing. In particular, they would not have 60% enriched uranium. And this is the core of the issue. The key concern of the United States for the nuclear program right now is that Iran has made about 440 kilograms, about 1,000 pounds, of uranium enriched to a very high level, 60%. It is near bomb grade, which is 90%. In fact, you actually could construct a crude nuclear bomb out of that 60%. It would just take more of it. And if they still have those cylinders, we believe it's stored under Isfahan, the uranium conversion site, possibly at Natanz. We don't know for sure because we lost the inspectors' eyes on that over a year ago. If it's stored in these containers about the size of scuba tanks, and if Iran still has working centrifuges, wouldn't take many, a cascade or two, about 300 centrifuges, they could take that 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, feed it back into the centrifuges, and in about a week, maybe two, turn it into bomb grade, 90%. It doesn't take that much work to go from 60 to 90. And in a matter of a few weeks more, they could have the equivalent of 10 bombs. So can we get that material? Hold that thought. Could we have gotten it at the bargaining table? And this is the part that really makes this war unnecessary. The answer to that is yes. We know that in the week before Donald Trump decided, for whatever reason, to go to war, the Iranians had offered to voluntarily get rid of that material. That was the offer on the table. They agreed to get rid of that material, and the details would need to be worked out, downgraded, whatever way, and to suspend any further uranium enrichment for a period of 3 to 4 years. That was the core of their agreement. That is a good deal. In fact, it was
So,
so good that the British National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell, who was involved in the talks, said that they were all surprised by this deal. This was much more than they thought the Iranians were willing to offer, and it wasn't going to be their final offer. They were supposed to go back on the Monday. Remember, Trump started bombing on Saturday. Monday, they were supposed to go in further technical talks and negotiate this. And the Iranians said, look, we have this uranium. It's good for about 10 to 11 bombs. We're going to give it up. That is not what Steve Witkoff told the president. He said that Iran was bragging about its ability to make 11 bombs, that it would never give up uranium enrichment. It's true, Iran wasn't going to give up permanently uranium enrichment, but a 3 to 4 year suspension in diplomatic talk, that's almost forever, a 3 to 4 year suspension. That is a great amount of time to buy to solve this problem more permanently. In fact, the Oman mediator in this talk, the foreign minister of Oman, flew to Washington on the Friday before Donald Trump started bombing to brief Vice President Vance because he didn't trust Jared Kushner or Steve Witkoff to accurately convey the details of the Iranian offer. And he was shocked by the bombing. He wrote in a social media post that he was dismayed that the U.S. had abandoned negotiations. So he blamed the United States for doing this. So we had a deal. We had solved the problem back in 2013, 2014, 2015. We had solved it. Trump pulls out of the deal in 2018, promising a bigger, better deal, never delivered on that. And as a result, the clock started ticking towards military action, because if you're not going to solve it diplomatically, you're on the path to war. We've always known that. That's been true for 30 years, since Benjamin Netanyahu in 1992 started warning us that Iran was 2 years away from a nuclear weapon when he was just a member of the Knesset. He's always wanted to attack Iran. He never found a president stupid enough to do it until he reached Donald Trump, because everybody knew what was going to happen if you did started a war like this. This is what was going to happen. He was amply warned. Military experts have known for decades that this is what would happen if you started a war. So here we are, we're left with this mess. I've only got a minute to wrap this up. Is there a military solution to this? The President of the United States has ordered 2,500 Marines and a Marine Expeditionary Unit to the Gulf. They should be there in about a week. He suspended the exercises for the 82nd Airborne, leading people to suspect that they might be involved. There's rumors that they're going to be used to take Karg Island, the oil and gas node for Iran. But one other possible mission is to go try to get the 440 kilograms at the Isfahan site, which I've actually been to. I visited the Isfahan site, or wherever else it's stored. That is a near impossible mission. That would be the most difficult commando raid in history. It's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. Isfahan is 500 miles from the Iranian border and perhaps 700 miles from a staging area, making a huge transportation difficulty just to get there. And once you get there, it's not like this is in a warehouse. You can go steal it, like Israel stole the Iranian nuclear files several years ago in a daring raid in Tehran. No, 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 no. It's the tunnels that get you to that material are covered in sand and some say concrete on this. So you would need to drop in excavating tools. You'd have to drop in bulldozers to move that dirt. Well, we have Army engineers who can do that, but under fire, in combat, we have done something like this before. We have retrieved about 500 kilograms of highly enriched uranium from Kazakhstan, but it was during peacetime with Kazakhstan's cooperation. We went and removed this dangerous material and brought it to safety and disposed of it. It took a month. It took a month to do it in peacetime. That gives you some idea of how difficult this mission would be. It would be, and all the while these military forces would be under fire. So we've created a real mess here for no good reason. We had solved the problem. Donald Trump unsolved the problem, promised a better solution, and has delivered a mess.
Exactly.
Stop there.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm pretty sure Trump is not aware of any of the things that you have mentioned, or so it seems. I just want to remind our audience that they can submit their questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to that in the last section of this webinar. Rob, I want to come back to you, and I want to come back to your book that you published last year, which I think it was an excellent book with rich experience that you wrote with Hussein Agha. And the title gives it away. Tomorrow's yesterday, and how things that we've seen with the Gaza war, it resonates with history. Do you think it's the same with Iran? Is tomorrow's yesterday with Iran, or are we just seeing a completely different dynamic and we're treading on like very different waters here?
So thanks. Listen, tomorrow's never exactly like yesterday, but in many ways, tomorrow is a reflection and a reenactment of yesterday in terms of American intervention in the Middle East, in terms of its proclivity to engage in military action when it's unnecessary and unlawful. Everything Joe very well articulated. And if you even look at what's happening in Lebanon now with Israeli games of trying to get parts of the Lebanese state go after Hezbollah, and how much that's reminiscent and reach a deal with Israel against the wishes of at least a powerful constituency in Lebanon. All of this, and it shows you how you have pyromaniacs who are playing with the region the same way they've played with it time and again, without learning from history, and therefore bound to repeat it. So yes, I think I'm not trying to say that Iran is not to blame for a lot of why we are where we are today. But in terms of U.S. policy and in terms of privileging military means and of demonizing adversaries to make it almost impossible to reach a deal, and then when you reach a deal, as Joe said, it's so easy then to tear it up, a point that Stephen Wertheim and I made in another piece. I think all of that is very much a reenactment of the past. And if the past is prologue, we know that even short-term victories, so even imagining if President Trump manages to do whatever he claims he wants to do, and Israel manages to do whatever they claim they want to do, we know that all these victories are short-lived, they backfire, and they backfire in ways that are not always easy to predict and very hard to manage, whether it's forms of terrorism, whether it's instability, whether it's refugee flows, whether it's the emergence of even more radical and militant forces. All these things we have seen, and you know this as well as anyone, time and time and time again. And I'll just end, I ended my last intervention by some ray of hope. I think as Joe's laid out and Sina's laid out, they're much more pessimistic scenarios. The U.S. trying to take Kark Island, which I hear is a very real possibility. Where does that lead? How will Iran react to that if some of its territory is occupied by the U.S.? An HEU raid, which again seems fantastical, but I wouldn't put anything past the minds of the U.S. or of Israel, trying to go after the new supreme leader of Iran. Anything that would give President Trump what he thinks would be a denouement to this war, which would only be the beginning of its next more escalatory phase.
Thank you, Rob. Sina, I want to ask you about the U.S. strategy, if that's one, and Israel's as well. I mean, it seems like from Khamenei to Larijani, they are trying to dismantle the leadership of the regime. But also, those are like the people who would have been able to come back to the table and have a deal of there's some way for an off-ramp. Explain to us, I mean, just like how irredeemable the situation right now. Do they have, as they claim, that the structure in place, and it doesn't matter if leadership is eliminated or certain personality are eliminated, it is not a dismantling of the regime? And also, again, the question of like who would be possible if that ever happens, that there will be a deal.
Yes, well, we've seen that they've moved their goalposts many times. I mean, it's all over the place. It's very incoherent. But when Trump launched this war, he launched it very much with regime change rhetoric and aspirations. I mean, he called for Iranian people to take to the streets. This is your chance. Took out Khamenei in the opening blow. But since then, that has not borne out. I mean, after Khamenei got taken out, we've seen that the Islamic Republic's base, which it does have a base, I mean, I think more so than what Saddam Hussein had in 2003, what Muammar Gaddafi had in 2011, that the Islamic Republic, which has shed a lot of legitimacy since 1979, arguably, it still has a sizable base. And the assassination of Khamenei in particular in that opening day and the way he was assassinated, seemingly in his above ground residence with a number of family members, that really radicalized a lot of the base of the Islamic Republic. It also played into the kind of ideology of both the Islamic Republic and more traditional Shia ideology about martyrdom. So we've seen that since then, it's been the Islamic Republic's base, and beyond that, I would argue, that's been in the streets and the regime has shown no signs of splintering or fracturing. I mean, ahead of this war, this was all very much telegraphed, both in Iranian publicly stated military doctrines that were amended, both in letters to the UN, both in terms of the speeches that Khamenei made about both how they were preparing for this war and also that it would be a regional war. Like Khamenei himself said that it would be a regional war. But one big lesson that the Iranians seem to have drawn from the last June war and just Israel's campaigns against Hamas and Hezbollah has been dispersing political and military officials and infrastructure, and each official having multiple successors, as well as delegating authority. For example, with the presidential administration, Pezeshkian, like delegating more authority to the provinces, the governors, things like that, to basically make themselves more resilient against decapitation strikes. But these decapitation strikes, where they have occurred, Khamenei, more military figures, Ali Larijani most recently, they haven't affected the core systemic decision-making structure, which it continues to be a systemic decision-making structure. I mean, the Islamic Republic, yes, the supreme leader had ultimate veto power, but really the decision-making structure was a consensus-driven approach from various institutions, most notably the Supreme National Security Council, which is memberships from many other bodies, as well as the heads of the three branches of government, the presidency there, the judiciary, the parliament. And it seems very much that this decision-making structure is still intact, that they are the ones making the ultimate decision on Iran's strategy. There is this mosaic defense structure that they've had in which these military units are operating according to kind of predetermined plans and targets. And it seems like maybe on occasion there may have been some incoherence with instructions reaching them, or maybe some targets hit that they didn't want to be hit. That's a question mark. But regardless, this has made them more able to fight back and fight back immediately, despite the initial decapitation strike that Saturday when the war started. I think it was very striking that when the June war started, Israel similarly in the opening blow took out a lot of the top military leadership, and Iran really had a kind of decision making or just paralysis across its military. For about 15 hours, they weren't able to retaliate with missiles. This time they retaliated immediately. They've been keeping up those missile strikes. So all this is to say that despite the deep-seated discontent in Iranian society, which does exist, despite it is a polarized society across multiple fault lines, the Islamic Republic has its base. It's maintained control. The regime has shown signs of cohesion, not fracturing or defections. Its supporters have been in the street, and we've seen no protests. We haven't seen any uprising, any of these things that it seems like Netanyahu and Trump have been betting on and agitating for, really trying to foment unrest as well, and that hasn't happened. And Iran is on this trajectory of continuing and maintaining its missile and ballistic drone firings and its drones and missiles. It seems like in the past day that tempo has gone up. So in that regard, it seems like Trump has hit a big wall.
Right. So again, like this is how authoritarians go to war. And I want to go back to you, Joe, and your excellent piece in the New Republic is like, this is not how democracies go to war. How do you see the impact of this war in the continuous erosion of US democracy, and how badly is it affecting us? Joe, you're muted. And just to remind everyone, keep submitting the questions to the Q&A as we go.
I'll be real quick here so we can get to the
No, no,
question.
no, please go ahead. I mean,
I, I think there's an overall general consensus among most international experts that this war is devastating for U.S. standing in the world. You have to understand what we did. We had united Europe and much of the world to oppose Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Why? Because it was a violation of the UN Charter, which prohibits any nation from using force to challenge the territorial integrity or political independence of another nation. It is the core issue. It is Chapter 1, Article 2 of the UN Charter that we wrote. It is the core of the international system that we constructed after the devastation of World War I and World War II. Putin violated that. It was the first time since World War II that a European nation had violated the borders of another country. We opposed that. We respected the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. We are doing exactly that same thing in Iran. We may think we have justification for it. We are saying Iran is an odious, terrible, repressive regime. That's all true. But we say that we have the right by ourselves to plunge that region into war. Not only do we violate international law, we're violating American law. The president doesn't have the authority to take the nation to war. That is vested by the Constitution in the Congress. The Congress is supine in the slavish Republican majorities in the House and Senate. They have relinquished that authority, but that doesn't make it legal. That doesn't make it right to do it. And by the way, when this outrageous supplemental comes up, anyone who is voting for that supplemental is voting for the war. You can't be against this war. You can't think this is a bad war and then fund the war. You can't reward the president by saying, well, wars are free. You want to go to war anytime you want, even if we disagree, we'll still pay for it. No, you can't do that. So all of this shatters the sort of the diplomatic standing of the United States in the world. We're just like Russia. We're just like, why exactly can't China take Taiwan? How is China taking Taiwan different from us going after Iran, or as the president said, taking Cuba? How exactly is that different? So you're undermining the diplomatic system that has protected nations large and small for almost 80 years. This is the most dramatic retreat of the United States from global leadership in our lifetimes. We haven't seen anything like this. Even when the two Bushes went to war with Iraq, they sought congressional authorization. They sought UN Security Council approval, getting it in one case, being denied it the second. Trump trashes all this. And for what? For what aim? What are we going to get out of this? No, people look around the world, look at the United States with not only diminished eyes, not only have we lost stature, but we're now seen as a threat to their integrity. The European leaders are talking like this. They have to prepare their collective defense. This is Canadian leader Kerry's remarks at the Davos conference. We have to guard against a threat from the East and a threat from the West.
yeah,
Denmark, I'll close right here. Here's an example of this. Denmark's forces are in Greenland now. Why? To protect Greenland from the United States. That's why they're there with plans, and as the Washington Post disclosed a couple of days ago, prepared to blow up the airfields to prevent U.S. planes from landing in Greenland. We've never seen anything like this in our lifetime. It's not just embarrassing, it's dangerous to have this crack up of the international system led caused not by Putin, not by Xi
yeah.
Jinping, but by Donald Trump.
Yeah, it is tragic, and also, I mean, very revealing on the level of hypocrisy around it. I was like amazed listening to one of the foreign ministers of in the Gulf talking about, I mean, the breach of international law. It was like interesting to hear like this is what you gather after undermining international law for years, thinking that it's not going to affect you, but now you need it and you contributed to undermining. It's like speaking of all of them. Rob and Sina, I have questions for you. The question is for you both. What do you see as possible off-ramps to end the war? Will Israel agree to a ceasefire anytime soon? Rob, could you go first?
Listen, the off-ramp, I think, is what I was talking about earlier, is when the pressure grows on President Trump to decide he cannot continue this war because of its economic impact, his political impact. He has midterms coming up. I can't imagine who in America is going to be more likely to vote for the Republican coalition that has been, as Joe said, so slavishly deferring to Trump as a result of this war. And I could think of a lot of people who will vote against that coalition because of the war. So that combination, again, plus other countries standing up to him rather than thinking that genuflecting to him is the way to get his favor, is standing up to him. That's the way to get his attention. So I think that's really the off ramp. Again, the question then is, what does Iran do? And that's tricky for all the reasons that Sina gave about how they're looking at this. But the first step is I believe, for the president understand this war is not just everything that Joe described and you did, unlawful, unnecessary, but it's also extremely costly to him. Unfortunately, we're dealing with a narcissist, and so appeal to principles and values and strategy are not going to help. It's what serves his own interest. And if people around him, those who are investing in the market, tell him this is going to be a disaster, it is a disaster. The price of oil is a disaster. I think that's the off ramp, and the sooner we get there, the better.
Sina?
Yes, I mean, it's really fascinating because Trump's decision-making model really suffers from the textbook problems of poor leadership decision-making. I mean, he surrounded himself with yes men, with sycophants, and people just want to tell him what he wants to hear, right? And that if he, like, you see these cabinet meetings where everyone is kind of like, everything's going great, you're great. And if anyone says anything critical, it seems like, they risk being fired, being marginalized. So this was obviously an environment that was prone to very terrible decision making. Now this one with immense consequences for America, just strategically, and getting down from this, as Rob said, it's like, who has Trump's ear, who can guide him to the right direction? Maybe these investors, maybe people who, he cares a lot about the stock market. Obviously, people in the Gulf, for the same reason that they were pushed towards detente with Iran and the Houthis because of the costs of this for them. This is that times 10, right? Iran is going to be there. That Iran, if this conflict continues, it's bad for them. If this conflict escalates to the point where Iran becomes a failed state or there's instability, that also is a terrible solution and for them, like to have prolonged instability in the Persian Gulf, if it becomes like a Libya there. So for them, de-escalation, having some kind of diplomatic end, as there is to all wars. Now, the question is, what does that look like for Iran? Can the US and Iran meet each other? Obviously, the political costs on both sides would be immense. It's very hard to imagine that anyone in Iran right now would agree to any sort of deal with America. But perhaps, in a more subtle way, Iran is looking for sanctions relief. For example, today, Treasury Secretary Bessent said that this Iranian oil on the seas, about 150 million barrels, could be sold. That is a de-escalatory move. It helps with de-escalation, but I think we have to see, are we going up the escalation ladder in the coming days, or are we going down? Is this Trump tweet yesterday about no more attacks on energy infrastructure, is that going to hold? What are the Iranians going to do? And then from there, de-escalatory moves such as this lifting the sanctions on some of these oils, but on Iranian oil exports. But Iran, I think a solution will have to come in the prism of Iran's relations with the GCC and this region together basically prospering and together being stable, or if it's zero sum, then it's just going to continue to go down this black hole, really.
Right. It was interesting. The post of Trump yesterday on Truth Social was saying, it's like, out of anger, Israel went ahead. And it's just like the language that using this as like a natural disaster happening to us all, and he doesn't have responsibility towards it. Joe, the next question is for you. says the war is taking place a month before the NPT review conference, just days before February 28th attack. The Trump administration sent a letter to Congress saying it was open to allowing uranium enrichment and reprocessing in Saudi Arabia under the additional protocol. How do you see these developments impacting the global non-proliferation landscape?
The risks of other countries getting nuclear weapons has just increased exponentially. There were already pressures underway, mainly caused by U.S. policy, not something happening to us, but things we were causing. Many of our allies were considering getting nuclear weapons because they felt that they could no longer trust U.S. security guarantees, the so-called nuclear umbrella or extended deterrence, where we would come to the aid of one of our allies if they were attacked with all of our military force, including nuclear weapons. So therefore, you Japan, you South Korea, you Germany, you Finland, you didn't have to get nuclear weapons because we were going to take care of you. Well, uh, who can believe that now? In fact, what you hear from diplomats all over Europe and in Asia is that they're starting to hedge their bets. They're starting to talk about this. You saw French President Macron change French nuclear policy to indicate that he was now open to forward deployment of French forces, which he was also going to increase into Europe. The British have announced that they're going to start increasing their forces as well. So there were already these pressures underway, leading to other countries reconsidering their options, ironically, mainly our allies. The lesson that countries are going to draw from this war is that if you want to protect yourself from a U.S. attack, you better get a nuclear weapon. And so that's going to accelerate programs, and especially, and it's going to, including some of our allies in the Gulf. Sina, I would, seek your wisdom on this. But part of what the questioner is asking is about the Saudi Arabian deal. They want to be allowed to enrich uranium. Well, why? Why does Saudi Arabia need to enrich uranium? It's the same question we had for Iran. You don't need to do this. There's a gigantic market on uranium. There's a glut of uranium on the world market. You can buy it. And Saudi Arabia still wants to do it. Well, that's the pathway to a bomb. You develop the civilian infrastructure to enrich uranium, and you use the same centrifuges for a nuclear weapon at the right moment. So you see that happening. And then, of course, there's the question of what Iran's going to do after this war is over. I got to believe that this has increased the pressure on Iran to get it to sprint for a bomb. And if they're left with that 440 kilograms and several cascades, you don't need much. You need thousands of cascades to do fuel, but you only need hundreds to do enrichment for bombs. They might decide that their best security bet, maybe their only security bet, is to develop a dozen or more nuclear weapons and then test one to demonstrate that if you do this again, we have a different response in mind this time. So this is a disaster for the non-proliferation regime. I expect the non-proliferation regime to collapse. I've been saying this for a while.
I know we've talked about this, and particularly after the strikes.
The review conference to be a disaster.
Yeah. Rob, I want to come back to your first comments, and I know we all want the war to end at any cost, with any reason and justification. If it's like Trump wakes up tomorrow and say we won, and we say, oh, you won. I really have a lot of issues with this approach. And I know we don't have many options, but back in June, we were faced by this where even the opposition were debating is let's all agree, yes, he obliterated the nuclear site. Let's agree to that. So there would be no justification for going back. And I thought this is a bad idea. I wrote about it because of a few reasons. I mean, first of all, we cannot normalize deceit as our road to peace and stability. Second, it completely closes the doors for accountability, because if it was justified and it was a win, what accountability is to be there? And third, it really doesn't deter or stop further, as we see evidently, further attacks. And my question here, we're in a very difficult position, is between this option, which means that this will be repeated again and again, eliminate any opportunities for real accountability, which is I see as one of the reasons why, I mean, we keep seeing those episodes over and again. So what do you think about that?
I completely agree, and yet I don't see an alternative to what I put forward. If you have an idea, but I just don't think that we are in a world right now where you could reach a conclusion to this war that would satisfy what should be minimal issues about accountability, about justice, about ensuring that this won't happen again. I just don't see how we're going to get there. And I truly feel, I think this war is much more perilous even than the 2003 invasion of Iraq. I think we're already seeing that it has been regionalized, it's being internationalized, and I think Sina said it. Iran is not Iraq. It has an ability to do things, and it has support within its own country, even though maybe minority support, but the ability to do things that go well beyond what Saddam Hussein could have done. So I just look at it from that perspective. It's already harming the Iranian people. It's harming people in the region. It's going to have huge impact on prices of basic foodstuffs around the world. So that's what I'm looking at. And, yes, I think there needs to be a resolution that addresses not just what people are looking at, and I don't mean you, but other think tanks. What about Iran's missile and drone capability? Yes, okay, but what about America's presence in the region, its militarized presence in the region? What about an out of control in Israel that is, as I said earlier, is regionalizing its, mow the lawn at the nth degree? All of those have to be addressed. But I don't see how we're going to address them, and questions of accountability so that we don't see this happen again. But that's unfortunately another world. I wish we were living in it, but I just don't see how that's going to happen, which is why I say the priority now is to prevent this from reaching yet another level in what is already for several levels too high. So in this respect, I want to be a realist and say, end it. Trump declares victory, but so will Iran, by the way. Survival of the regime is a huge, victory narrative for them. And then at that point, think of diplomatic solutions or arrangements that are going to minimize the risk of this happening again.
Can I just have a quick
Right.
follow on to
Yeah, absolutely.
So do you think that our Arab allies are going to rethink their security relations with the United States after this, that having bases in their U.S. bases in their nations might not be providing the protection they thought?
I think there's a real paradox. If I were sitting in the GCC or Arab country, they've made two bets. One bet was the American security umbrella, and the other bet was improving relations with Iran. The American security umbrella has proved to be completely unreliable, and improving relations with Iran has proven to be equally ineffective. And yet, paradoxically, I think they're going to come out of this war still needing whatever is left of the American security umbrella and still concluding that they need to try to have some form of coexistence with Iran. So over time, do they try to find other mechanisms? Maybe, but right now, it's precisely because those two pathways have failed that I think they will keep living with them for lack of a better alternative. At the end of this war, response to you, response to Nancy, at the end of this war, nothing will have been resolved. But I still want it to end even with nothing resolved, because if we don't end it now, everything that is not resolved will only get worse.
Yes. The person
Right.
that's the happiest with this war is George W. Bush, because he's no longer responsible for committing the greatest strategic blunder in U.S. history.
Yeah. We're down to the last minute, and I want to end up with you, Sina. Tomorrow is Eid al-Fitr, and first of all, Eid Mubarak. And this is a time where there are big gatherings. I mean, people coming to prayers, and is the regime nervous about such gatherings, and could that lead to other violence from the regime side? And also, I mean, speaking of that, I mean, it's like, what is the status of like human rights and the rights of the Iranian people, like in the future, given the current situation?
Yes, I'll just be brief, but we are in a situation. Well, actually, tomorrow is both Nowruz, and then Eid al-Fitr will be on Saturday in Iran. It'll be kind of in the midst of all this darkness, these two holidays in Iran. In terms of a potential flashpoint for protests, it was more likely to happen on Charshamba Suri, which is the last Wednesday of the year, and it's a holiday in Iran that people light firecrackers and fireworks, and it's been associated with to a degree with kind of anti-regime sentiment. And Reza Pahlavi issued a call for Charsham Masuri this past couple days ago, and he also claimed that his immortal guards were activated, but nothing really happened this time. So I think that speaks to his decreasing legitimacy. In January, for the first time, people did take to streets for 2 days after a call issued by Pahlavi in the wake of those protests. Thousands came to the streets, and thousands were massacred, really. You had, according to credible estimates from US-based organizations, upwards of 7,000 people were killed on those several days in January. Hundreds of security forces and other people, but the vast majority were protesters. And that was a context where also Trump and Netanyahu and Reza Pahlavi himself were trying to exploit that to a maximum degree in a very cynical way. Like Trump said, we're locked and loaded. We're going to help the protesters. Take to the streets. Take your institutions. Reza Pahlavi called on people to take city centers. And what happened was there was a narrative sold of a weak regime that is crumbling, that only needs one more push to fall apart, and that didn't bear out. So a lot of people got killed, by this repressive authoritarian regime at the end of the day that is now, again, more radicalized. Its base is more radicalized. And I think what often follows in patterns of outside security pressure, war, is that these kind of authoritarian systems grow more insular and even more repressive. So sadly, I think after this war, absent a horizon for Iran that could bring some kind of relief and economic relief, it's probably going to become more insular now with Mojtaba Khamenei and this risk of it developing nuclear weapons and potentially becoming this kind of like North Korea on the Persian Gulf.
And how about on the side of the diaspora, the split that is there? Do you see any people are changing their position because of the war?
Yes, oh, absolutely. I mean, in general, it's a sad state of affairs because Iranians are very divided in the midst of all these, the domestic repression, the traumas inflicted by the Islamic Republic over decades, and all the foreign pressure and sanctions and war and all the kind of disinformation campaigns, I would argue. But yes, absolutely. There's a very noticeable, just from people I know, people I talk to, sources in Iran, family in Iran, the people who were more hopeful that maybe something good can come out of this. Now, when they're seeing, these fuel depots hit in Tehran and there's acid rain and oil rain, and Trump is talking about, is Iran's map going to look the same after this? Probably not. Or trying to potentially, entertaining all these proposals for maybe arming Kurds to attack Iran, to attack, this. Even yesterday in his tweet, he really threatened if energy facilities are targeted again, that he's going to destroy all of Iran's oil facilities, which that would just destroy the whole region and destroy Iran's economy for a long time. So I do feel, and there's been a lot of reports as well from mainstream publications here in the US, that many people who had hoped that this could lead to something better, that there's a noticeable shift in that constituency as well among Iranians.
Thank you, Sina, Joe, and Rob. I mean, I really appreciate your candid views and discussion, your expertise. Really grateful for that. For our audience, I mean, all the articles and books that we mentioned are linked online, and you can find them there. I hope that we don't need to come back to you to continue the conversation. Unfortunately, it looks like this would be in it for a while. Hopefully not. But again, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you everyone who joined us online.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.